Welcome back to MMA Al Dente. I am the jerk-off who picked Michel Pereira to defeat Anthony Fluffy Hernandez. And don't you forget it. All right, I'm here to break down UFC 308. Okay, opening up UFC 308, we have Ibo Aslan versus Rafael Cerqueira. My prediction for this fight is Rafael Cerqueira wins, and I'll go with him winning by knockout in early round two. And the basis for the prediction is that I've seen a highlight reel of his. That's right. That's the basis. I've seen offense of his. Yeah, look, I don't have real. I didn't even want to give a prediction here. I just know you got your fucking gun out, so I better do it. But I don't really even have a prediction here. My prediction really is that it ends violently. And I'd be interested in looking at the under over the under over. Who the fuck says that? The over under and the knockout lines and the rest of it. But I just think this will be a clash between two potent finishers, very big, dangerous, physical guys. They're a physical match for each other, and I think they're also not the most versatile fighters either. Where we could just expect a clash here that's going to end with a knockout in one way or another. It'd be interesting to see who can employ tactics, even kickboxing wise. I want to see what this guy Shakira's got to offer. If he's got to employ some tactics and try to work some calf kicks from the outside or whatever. But I can't trust anything about him because I've only seen the highlight reel. I've seen one fight of his, and he looked like the best fucking fighter in the world and put the guy away in brutal fashion. But he just hasn't fought anybody of note, and I haven't seen anything from him, let alone a lowlights video of every moment of adversity, if he's ever had any. So I can't trust anything about him. He does have one decision, which I suppose is a good look, but that was way back in his career. And he's full of round one finishes. Ibo Aslan, same thing for him. I've seen more of his footage, of course. Ibo Aslan, he's 13-1, but he does have two round three finishes over solid fighters. Anton Turkali, the one guy to beat him, and Robert Valentin, who I think is in the UFC still after losing in the Ultimate Finale. But those were both competitive fights and fights where I'm sure he was tired, and he certainly looked tired, but he was able to force a finish and show his danger down the stretch. Got it done in brutal fashion, especially against Robert Valentin. And I think that's a great look for somebody who's full of round one destructions, which is every other one of his victories. But at the same time, he hasn't faced adversity too much. And one of the times he did was against Anton Turkali in the first fight. And he did, he was pouring it on Anton Turkali and really tried to force the finish, gassed himself out. And the moment the tide turned, he collapsed and got submitted. I don't think that's exactly a path to victory, the submission anyway, for Cerqueira, but I don't think it's a lock that Ibo Aslan should have the better gas tank by any means. I really don't know. And again, I do think this fight can and most likely will be solved and settled on that level one physicality basis. The power, the strength, and these are two 6'4" monsters colliding, potent finishers, and I think it ends with somebody's chin getting clipped, so or body perhaps, because this guy Cerqueira, he does have nice body shots as well. But yeah, I really don't have a prediction for this one. I just think it'll be violent. I wish I saw more on Cerqueira. Now put away your fucking gun. Next up, we have Ismail Naurdiev making his return to the UFC, taking on Brunno Silva. My prediction for this fight is Silva wins by knockout in round one. I'm not too confident in this prediction, but it is my prediction, what I think is most likely to happen. Brunno is exceptionally dangerous. I know he doesn't have a lot of momentum on his side. He's 1-5 in his last six, and he's also 35 years old. But I still think that danger hasn't gone anywhere. And of course, he's been mixing it up with UFC level fighters and even champions. And that's never going to make your record look too pretty. But yeah, I'm going with him despite being 7 years older than 28-year-old Naurdiev. I think he'll be able to go through Naurdiev with his danger. Naurdiev's only been finished once. Well, his chin has only failed him once, I should say. And it was a year and a half ago. This guy, Vadim, good fighter, caught him when it looked like Naurdiev was maybe going to be putting him away. And the fight turned on a dime and he was taken out. And of course, I think Brunno Silva is more dangerous than probably anybody Naurdiev has fought as far as the knockout threat goes. And yeah, I mentioned one win in his last six or whatever. That was over Brad Tavares. So yeah, Brunno Silva is very dangerous, and I'm picking that danger to shine here and to get Naurdiev out of there. Naurdiev was in the UFC, like I mentioned, 5 years ago, whatever. It's where he suffered two of his seven losses, where he was losing a wrestling grind to Sean Brady and to Chance Rencounter, very capable fighter, Chance. And even the fight before that, he also lost by decision. His last loss before that, I should say, wrestling was the story of the loss, despite Naurdiev coming alive in round three and almost putting away the other guy, Ismail de Jesus. But yeah, he's a guy that can be neutralized like that, and I don't think that's a factor in this matchup. I think this is going to be a fight where if he does lose, it's by getting finished. I think we're going to get a striking battle where Ismail Naurdiev is the better hustler, but he's the less dangerous guy and perhaps the more vulnerable guy. And I also think, look, he's the more likely guy to mix things up and to score any sort of grappling success at all. But he's not the biggest threat there, even though he did get a nice submission in his last fight. But despite Brunno Silva having been submitted in the majority of his losses, 7 of his 11 losses or whatever, he has only ever been submitted by excellent submission artists. I've been through it in previous videos where I list the submission win-loss record for everybody who's beaten him, and it's phenomenal. You start to get a lot more losses when it's guys like Gerald Mearshart, but that guy is obviously as dangerous as a submission artist gets in the UFC. So yeah, that's the level of guys that are taking out Brunno Silva or have over the years. I don't think Naurdiev is that type of grappler. The majority of his subs come on the regional scene in Europe. But I do think that he'd be the more likely guy to score points there, mixing it up and just hustling, but not really to any major success where he's going to close the show on Brunno Silva. I do think this is going to be largely a kickboxing bout. And I do think Brunno Silva, his danger is always going to be there for him. And that's what I'm picking to close the show. Naurdiev was knocked out the once a year and a half ago. He was TKO'd by leg kicks against Jarrah Al Salawi a few years ago as well. I mean, Brunno Silva, he's not like Mr. Disciplined leg kick guy, but everything he does hurts. But really, the prediction here is punch or a knee finding the chin of Naurdiev and it being too much. Brunno Silva's a potent finisher. I talked about his losses. He's got 23 wins with 20 knockouts and 0 submissions, I may as well mention. And yeah, by the way, Naurdiev has been submitted twice as well. Once even recently and once a decade ago or whatever. But I didn't harp on it because, I don't consider that too big of a threat here. But when somebody like Brunno Silva's losses include 7 submissions, then yeah, I feel like I should waste a minute talking about that. But anyway, I do think this will be mostly standing. I think Naurdiev will be the better hustler, but I've got Brunno Silva closing the show with his power and putting Ismail Naurdiev away. That's the prediction. Silva by knockout in round 1. Next up, we have Rinat Fakhretdinov taking on Carlos Leal Miranda, who is stepping up on very short notice here, making his UFC debut as a replacement for Nursultan Ruzaboyev. My prediction for this fight is Rinat Fakhretdinov wins by decision. The basis for the prediction is not because Carlos Leal took the fight on short notice. He's actually in optimal condition, I believe, because he had a fight booked for next week anyway. But I do think Rinat Fakhretdinov despite some recent difficulties. He's a guy that is a reliable grinder at the UFC level, and I think he's going to be able to outpoint Carlos Leal Miranda, especially if he's able to take him to the ground, which I think he will be. But even if he's not able to take him to the ground, the fight becomes a lot more difficult. But Rinat has still shown he's at the very least got the heart and the durability to give himself a chance to win a scrap like that, which of course he did against Nicholas Dalby. But yeah, let me talk about that. He's got a lot of professional momentum, Rinat, undefeated in the UFC and whatever, but really his last two fights have halted his momentum a bit in the real world. Because despite looking great on paper, he was nearly stopped against Eliseo Zaleski dos Santos, uh, nearly taken out with a body shot, and then had to resist getting pounded and choked and fight to survive for the whole round there. And against Nicholas Dalby, he walked away with a decision. And like I said, he gave himself a shot with his toughness and his heart. But I did think he was outlasted and outpointed there by Nicholas Dalby. And I'm sure a lot of others feel the same way as well. So he's looking real pretty with the 4 or 5 wins in the UFC or whatever it is. But again, he's shown to be vulnerable. And I'm sure there's a lot more fighters nowadays than there were a year ago that think they can beat Rinat Fakhretdinov and would be more willing to take on the fight. But here, despite him fighting a very difficult guy in Carlos Leal Miranda, who on top of being in shape is very durable, has only been finished once by an armbar 10 years ago, and he's also a reliable grinder himself. He's a comfortable 3-round fighter. But despite all that, I'm picking Rinat to win because I think he's in his prime. He's still a guy who's done enough inside the UFC alone in his short career here where with those victories alone, I favor him to win this fight against Carlos. But look, Carlos Leal Miranda, he's got a record of 21-5. His 5 losses are all to good fighters. Only one of them is a finish, and it was at armbar 10 years ago, whatever, over 10 years ago. And speaking of 10 years, only one guy has beaten him in the last 10 years, and that's Sadabusi, who is a championship level fighter in the PFL. And he beat Carlos twice, both by really tight decision and both in 3-round fights. Those were examples of Carlos Leal Miranda's forward pressure, which I always say is worth a half a point on the judges' scorecard. The guy that you know is going to be moving forward. Well, there it wasn't enough in those fights, even though you could argue it was, to be honest. But he was fighting a difficult guy in Sadabusi who's excellent on the back foot, which makes that pressure mean a little less. And he's also very difficult to bully around in the clinch because he's gigantic. But still, Carlos did pressure him and give him an excellent battle. My point is he could easily be undefeated for the last 10 years. But he still had some other close fights as well. Really close fight against Chris Brown in the PFL. Another tight decision. But that was one where I thought, if anything, his cardio helped him out in that fight. Because he was conceding some rough positions and some bad spots early. But he had the pressure going for him. And his heart and the rest of it got him the victory. He's not the most dominant fighter, Carlos Leal Miranda, but he is still dangerous. He's got 10 knockouts. Half his wins are by knockout, and his last 4 wins are all by knockout. Some over good established fighters like David Zavada, UFC guy, and Delano Taylor, who I believe retired, Rory McDonald, I think. He's dangerous enough himself, and he's got a lot of great traits as a fighter. But I'm picking Rinat Fakhretdinov to win. I don't think it'll look much like the Sadabusi fights, but I think it's a fight I've seen Rinat win against other good fighters. He's been able to score those points against Brian Battle and even Andreas Michailidis and even fucking Zaleski dos Santos and Nicholas Dalby. And I think here he'll be able to put it all together and win by decision. I'll look for the odds. I don't have the odds yet. I expect Rinat to be a favorite. I would look for the decision prop. But I think this could be a fight where if I was to bet on anything, it could be Carlos Leal Miranda plus 3.5 points because I trust his durability, which is half that battle anyway. And he's got to win a round after that, which if his skills aren't enough to do it, maybe Renat's cardio is enough to give that up. So if anything, that'd be what I'm playing. But the prediction is Rinat Fakhretdinov wins a decision. And I'll wait to see what things look like. Next up, we have Farid Basharat taking on Victor Hugo or Victor Hugo Silva. And my prediction for this fight is Farid Basharat wins by round 3 submission. Although a decision certainly wouldn't surprise me. But regardless, I think to win this fight, he's got to get the fight to the ground. And I do think he will get the fight to the ground. Once on the ground, or even on the feet, he's got to slow down Victor Hugo Silva. Because Victor's the more dangerous, explosive guy. And he's versatile. He can give you problems anywhere. But I think Farid Basharat will definitely win the wrestling and control battle. And in one way or another, I think that finds him a victory here. Having said that, there's no value on his money line. That's the only thing available right here. He's a 13-2 favorite, minus 650. That is no good. All the value right now is on Victor Hugo Silva, who's at almost 5-1 odds. And he's a guy who, despite me picking against him, and despite him having 4 losses already, as opposed to 0 for Basharat, all 4 of those losses take place over 10 years ago. The last one was an injury, so it doesn't even count. And to help the matter, I haven't seen any of these losses. So I suppose that helps his image for me there. But I still think Farid Basharat is an exceptional fighter, and he's going to give him a test like he hasn't had probably ever in his career, and certainly not lately. And he's going to be that much more dangerous matchup and hand him his first loss in 10 years. Uh, but again, Victor Hugo Silva, very dangerous guy, probably more dangerous on the ground than he is on the feet, but he still brings the danger everywhere. And he's a guy who showed in his last fight he can win a hard fought 15-minute fight at the UFC level. I thought he outlasted Pedro Falcao in that fight and was the better man down the stretch in general. Even though early he was conceding some control and it was still a close fight. But a close, hard fought fight that did go the way of Victor Hugo Silva. And of course, before that, to get into the UFC, he got a knee bar in round 2 on the Contender Series, which is always a great look. But yeah, danger, I'd say, is on Victor Hugo Silva's side. But I think Farid Basharat's going to slow this fight down enough, start that movement, because Victor Hugo Silva, he'll be throwing fucking go-go platas and whatever else he can. And I think once he slows down Victor Hugo Silva enough, Farid Basharat's danger will start to hit the surface and he can make things happen down the stretch. He's 12-0. He's got 1 knockout, but that's really not his big threat here in this matchup. It's the rear naked choke or the arm triangle choke like he got on Clayton Rodriguez. But yeah, he's got a really good top game, and it's produced some finishes for him throughout his career. 6 submissions. And he got 1 against Clayton Rodriguez in round 1. I think that's his only round 1 submission, though. So he's a guy who typically gets it done down the stretch, rounds 2 or 3, and that's what I'm predicting happens here. Again, I'd be maybe more confident in the prop pick or the prop bet and the specific prediction if I saw Victor Hugo Silva's losses, even though they're over 10 years ago, but I haven't seen them. I think he's an excellent fighter today. I think he belongs in the UFC, but I know that about Farid Basharat, and I think Farid Basharat's going to be too much for him here. Basharat by round 3 sub is the prediction, and as of now, there are no bets. Next up, we have Kennedy Nzechukwu taking on Chris HuggyBear Barnett. My prediction for this fight is Kennedy Nzechukwu wins by knockout in round 2. And it's going to take some props for me to even consider betting on Kennedy Nzechukwu because he's a gigantic favorite. However, his opponent here, Chris Barnett, unlike Victor Hugo Silva in the last fight, I think I can isolate 5-1 underdog Chris Barnett's path to victory to one thing, and that's knockout or TKO, even if it's due to exhaustion or whatever. So that'd be something I would be looking to waste some sprinkles on. But Kennedy Nzechukwu winning by knockout is the pick. I think he's going to do well in this fight. I think, of course, he's better at range. He's gigantic. His knockout losses, by the way, are to guys who could match his size. Da Un Jung and Dustin Jacoby, both 6'4", 6'5", or whatever. They've got a foot on Chris Barnett. So for Chris Barnett to hit that Hail Mary shot, it might entail a spin or a jump or whatever. And he's down for all of that, but he's only got so many of them in him, in my opinion. I do think Kennedy is able to thwart those wild attacks, keep his range, and I'm thinking part of the plan is to stab the body, whether outside or in tight or whatever. And eventually, I think he wears down Chris Barnett and beats him down for a stoppage in round two. Uh, Kennedy Nzechukwu, he's only got those two knockout losses. His submission loss is a round three triangle choke to Paul Craig. I don't think that's in the cards for old HuggyBear, but you never know, right? And I think Kennedy Nzechukwu is twice as dangerous as Chris HuggyBear Barnett. Chris has a lot of experience, and he's got a lot of finishes as well. But Kennedy's, despite having a shorter career, he's been in there with better guys, beaten and finished better guys. And I think here he's going to separate himself from Chris HuggyBear Barnett. I also think, look, I talked about the chin of Kennedy Nzechukwu, who's also rocked in many other fights and whatever. But he's moving up in weight here. So I think for a 6'5" guy that probably cut weight, or reasonably, he probably cut weight to make 205 if he's moving up here. I think that will only help his chin. I'm not sure how he's going to move at heavyweight and how he'll translate. His body will translate. But I think if the cut was any bit difficult at all, he's doing himself a big favor here, and probably his chin as well. So yeah, I've got Kennedy Nzechukwu taking over this fight and breaking down Chris Barnett. Chris Barnett, he's been in the UFC for a few years now, only a few fights, but he did lose two of them. He lost by technical decision to Martin Budai. That was in the third round where the fight was stopped, but whatever. He lost the decision. And he lost by round two guillotine choke to Ben Rothwell, which Kennedy Nzechukwu isn't the biggest submission threat out there, but he does have one submission, and it does come in his last win, and it was via guillotine choke in round two as well. So maybe there's something there. I am a degenerate. I'll be looking for the props. But regardless of whether it's TKO or guillotine choke, I think Kennedy does slow down Chris Barnett, and I think he does break him down and put him away in the middle or end of this fight. He's Chris Barnett. He's got two victories as well in the UFC, but they're over lower end guys, Gian Vellante and Jake Collier. Those are capable fighters, but Gian was retired pretty much the moment he went to heavyweight and weighed 260 pounds. And Jake Collier, he already retired like fucking 7 years ago, but came back and as a heavyweight. A very talented guy, but obviously missing a lot, and the gas tank is part of it, and that cost him that fight. But he's been knocked out before that, Chris Barnett. He suffered a few knockout losses earlier in his career as well. At this point, we're talking 7, 8 years ago. But at this point, he's now 38 years old. So kind of evens out. I think Kennedy Nzechukwu will win this fight. I don't think it necessarily has to be him knocking out Chris Barnett, touching the chin. I think he's dangerous physically enough to go through his body and go through him in many different ways. So I've got Kennedy winning by round two knockout. Maybe I'll look to play some props. I have to see what odds present themselves. But the odds are so lopsided that right now the temptation is to wait for Chris Barnett's odds so I can waste some money right down the fucking toilet. Next up, we have Abusupian Magomedov taking on Brunno Ferreira. My prediction for this fight is Abus wins by knockout in round one, maybe round two. But I'm picking him to win here because, first of all, I don't think his weakness or the major weakness he's shown in the UFC anyway. His cardio is under such big threat here, such a big threat here. And it's not like he's definitely got bad cardio either. He looked all right in round 3 in his last fight, but if you look at his losses to Caio Bahayo and especially to Sean Strickland, he slowed down, especially in the Strickland fight where there was a definitive collapse. But still, here he's fighting a guy in Brunno Ferreira who has never seen round 2 aside from 80 seconds total in his whole MMA career. So he's just a stranger to the deep, exhausting fights, and there's no guarantee that he would do well there. And in fact, there's a lot of speculation that he wouldn't, if anything. And Abusupian, I talk about his, cardio issues against Strickland and whatever. He's still got 6 wins by decision. So he's been there and done that. And of course, he got his last win against Warley Alves by decision. And again, I thought he won all 3 rounds and looked pretty damn comfortable doing so. But here, I don't think he's going to win by decision. I think even if he was to drag Brunno Ferreira into deep waters, I'd still pick him to win by TKO or knockout. Brunno's only been beaten once, and he was stopped. He was knocked unconscious by Nursultan Ruzaboyev, who was supposed to be on this card. So it's not like I can say, oh, Brunno's always going to look this way or that way when he loses. He's only got the one loss. But it was a pretty memorable loss. And I think Abusupian is much more dangerous than he's shown in the UFC, certainly. And I think he can next level Brunno, maybe even drag him into deep waters, but then clip his chin, whether he's tired or not. And that's the fight I envision here. He did get that brutal finish I talked about over Dustin Stoltzfus, where he came onto the scene in the UFC and announced himself with a front kick and punches in 20 seconds. But I have to mention Brunno Ferreira knocked out Dustin Stoltzfus earlier this year, I believe, and he did so with some spinning back elbows that were phenomenal. And that was a fight that, even though it was pretty short, it still wasn't exactly going his way early. But yeah, Brunno's had an answer for everybody but Nursultan Ruzaboyev. And again, there's no telling how he's going to look in round 3. He might look like fucking Marab. I just doubt it. But I'm picking Abusupian to win this fight. Abusupian, he's been knocked out once by Lewis Taylor and then TKO'd by Sean Strickland. That wasn't a major failure of his chin, but, that was his cardio. And the submission loss for Abusupian and Magomedov, the submission losses, both come to good guys, and they're over a decade ago. So Bruno Silva, he's been able to put some guys away, but that shouldn't be in the cards for him. Dominating on the ground, let alone finishing Magomedov. Although Bruno, yeah, he's shown good, well-rounded skills throughout his short career, advancing and putting guys away on the ground via submission or TKO. Still, though, I think Abusupian is the seasoned vet here, the more well-rounded fighter. And I think despite some issues he's shown in the UFC, I think I would trust him down the stretch between the two of these guys. But yeah, I don't think the fight looks that way. I think he gets it done earlier than down the stretch, and he does so with a knockout. It's only happened once to Brunno Ferreira. It was just a year ago, though. And Brunno's looked great in the UFC, but he hasn't been so thoroughly tested yet. And you'll hear me say the same shit the next time if he walks away with another round 1 finish here. Because it's just the way it is. He's got some questions to answer, and he keeps putting it all off by knocking guys out in a few minutes. But still, I'm picking him to get knocked out here. Abusupian by knockout is the pick, and it's going in round 1. Next up, we have Said Nurmagomedov taking on Daniel Willie Cat Santos. My prediction for this fight is Said Nurmagomedov wins, and I'll go with him winning by decision, although he's got some really crafty chokes, so that's always a possibility. But I'm taking him winning by decision. I think he's got more ways to win. I envision him getting on top of Daniel Willie Cat Santos, and being like a regular Nurmagomedov. But of course, he's not really a regular Nurmagomedov, and he's an excellent striker on the feet. Really mixes things up very well. Great footwork and very comfortable from the outside. And of course, he's got great cardio and the rest of it. So he's a really well rounded guy. And I don't think Santos would be able to relax with him anywhere either. But I've got Saeed winning this fight on points, getting on top of him, and on the outside, on the feet anyway, keeping himself safe on the outside and giving Santos problems. Santos has lost twice, and his last loss came in his UFC debut by decision. Both losses are by decision. Julio Arce beat him by really beating him with fundamental kickboxing. Daniel Willie Cat Santos was in that fight, especially early, but as the fight progressed, he was just getting cleaned up by the cleaner striking of Julio Arce. But of course, after that, he rebounded with two great wins in the UFC, especially his comeback knockout over John Castaneda, where he was badly hurt, weathered the storm, survived, and then put away a guy who I think has excellent cardio in Castaneda. So that was an eye-opening victory. But again, here I think he's going to be limited against Saeed. Saeed's in his prime. He's such a well-rounded guy. He brings the danger everywhere, and he's also an excellent point fighter himself. Speaking of which, he's only got one loss in the last a few years, 5 years, and it's by very tight decision against Jonathan Martinez. Really could have gone the other way. And of course, aside from that, he's just got a ton of momentum. Submission finishes left and right over Cody Stamen, Muin Gafurov, both those guys with lightning fast guillotines within a minute. And he got a ninja choke victory over Saeed Yukub Kakramanov deep into round two, which was very impressive because that guy's fucking awesome and he was really taking it to Saeed. But of course, yeah, he's also the guy that's won the decision over Douglas Silva de Andrade and scratch and clawed for that decision early on against Justin Scoggins in his UFC career. And another tight decision, to be honest. But I do think he should win this fight against Daniel Santos. I think he's got more going on. Santos, I think, is incredibly dangerous, but it's not like Saeed Nurmagomedov has any major weakness either. We've seen him neutralized by Raoni Barcelos, outpointed barely by Jonathan Martinez, and his only other loss before that was by decision 10 years ago to another excellent fighter in Magomed Bibulatov. So, for a 32-year-old who's never been finished, as dangerous as Santos is, I don't think he's going to finish Saeed, and I doubt he finds a way to outpoint him either. Although, again, the Jonathan Martinez fight showed it could happen. But yeah, Saeed Nurmagomedov by decision is the pick. And of course, if he's winning, a submission is always possible, the way he's been lacing them up lately. Next up, we have Miktabek Orolbai taking on Mateusz Rebecki. My prediction for this fight is Orolbai wins by round 3 TKO, or knockout even. The basis for the prediction is that I do think Orolbai will be able to get on top of Rebecki, and I think once on top, he's at a big advantage. Rebecki, he's a little tank. He wants to be on top, and even though he's a versatile fighter and very skilled on the ground, I still think it's bad news if someone's able to dominate him from the top position. And of course, I have to mention he was TKO'd from the top position technically in his last fight. Not technically, that is what happened. But of course, the story of the loss was really his cardio, and Diego Ferreira really beat him up on the feet for 10 minutes before putting him away there. But that's one of his two losses. His other loss is also by knockout. This time he was knocked unconscious on the ground against this guy Pavel Kilek, who I've mentioned here on MMA Al Dente a few times. He was a capable fighter, and he was able to take advantage of Mateusz Rebecki, who had 3 heel hook victories to begin his career, and I think was a little too overzealous going for legs, and he ended up losing position. And once on his back against Pavel Kilek in his 4th fight, he got knocked unconscious. So yeah, that's how he's lost twice. And that's why I'm leaning more towards TKO, to be honest, than decision. One was a TKO to Diego Ferreira, and he was knocked unconscious by Pavel Kilek. And I do think on the feet, even though Miktabek Orolbai isn't the sharpest overall striker, he still throws good straight punches. He's been able to produce some knockout standing, so he's got some power there for sure. And of course, he's got 8 inches of height and 3 inches of reach. Strike that, reverse it. But he's got all that to complement his striking. So he's got a lot going for him in this matchup. I still think Mateusz Rebecki is going to give him trouble, but I do think Orolbai will be able to handle the trouble, get on top of him, put him in some bad spots, and treat him like a nail and hammer him for a finish. That's the prediction here. Orolbai's got one loss himself. It's a decision to this guy, Khalid Sachuev. It's a very close fight. It happened back in 2020 and really could have gone either way, but his wrestling was there for him, but not throughout the whole fight. And in the end, he wasn't able to take him down, and he was being outstruck. But he still had success with his grappling, and he showed a lot of great toughness and a lot of traits, losing his only fight like that. But look, he made his UFC debut last year, and he looked phenomenal. That was a short notice fight against Uros Medic, who I still think is an awesome fighter. And he dominated Uros Medic and ended up going through him on the ground with a neck crank in round 2. And then against Elvis Brenner, who's an incredibly talented fighter, he was able to survive some dangerous moments with Elvis when Elvis was able to reverse at him, get on top of him, even mount him. But in general, he was the one that was doing the dominating and the out wrestling, and he outpointed Elvis Brenner, and even again was the last man standing after some dicey moments in the middle there. So he's got a great record, a lot of great virtues as a fighter, and no real doubts. Whereas there's some doubts with Rebecki, and I also think technically he's at a disadvantage anyway with a guy that's bigger and going to be getting on top of him with his wrestling. So I've got Orolbai winning. I do think Rebecki is a problem on the ground. He's still an excellent submission artist, but I think he's going to be doing worse with someone on top of him. And I've got Orolbai winning by being on top of him, but the official prediction is he produces a finish, probably a little bit later, like Carlos Diego Ferreira, but with more ground control as opposed to that fight, which had a lot of Rebecki being beaten up, fatigued on his feet. Next up, we have Rafael Dos Anjos taking on Jeff Neal. My prediction for this fight is Jeff Neal wins by round 3 knockout. I'm really leaning on these round 3 finishes here. But look, I do think Jeff Neal will be a welterweight problem like Rafael Dos Anjos has faced in the last few years. He's run into a lot of welterweights that are just too physically strong for him to work his magic. I think Jeff Neal will fall into that class, but I don't think Jeff Neal is going to use his size and his welterweight frame to out-grapple Dos Anjos like a lot of these other welterweights have. I think Jeff Neal is going to use it to put his hands on Rafael Dos Anjos and try to get him out of there. And I'm predicting he does. Of course, Dos Anjos just needs 2 takedowns to win this fight. It is a 3-round fight. And even though I think he's going to turn 40 on the night of the fight. So even though he's very old for a fighter, he's still a guy who's historically been pretty durable. It's not like you can guarantee he'll get knocked out when he loses. It's only really happened 3 times. Eddie Alvarez, Jeremy Stevens, way back when, and I guess at this point, Eddie Alvarez is way back when. And Rafael Fiziev a few years ago also got him out of there. His other loss is to Clay Guida by injury, and that's it. It was actually listed as a submission for years, but now it's a TKO loss. Either way, it's not a big strike against his chin, unless it fucking dislocates again or whatever. But yeah, Rafael Dos Anjos is about to turn 40, and even though he doesn't have a reliably weak chin at all, he's a guy that's been out wrestled and out grappled in general at welterweight. But here he's fighting a bona fide welterweight who's going to use his size to try to cave your head in instead. And I think he's going to find himself in some danger if that wrestling is taken off the table. And that is the prediction as well. That's what happens. Jeff Neal, he's got a record of 15-6. He was knocked out once and submitted twice in his career. Shavkat Rakhmonov got him out of there with a rear naked choke. No shame there. Shavkat could be the champion of the world in a little bit. Martin Sano rear naked choked him in round 3 over a decade ago, so it doesn't matter. But just know that Martin Sano did come and have a cup of coffee in the UFC. And then the guys that TKO him, the only guy to TKO him is Kevin Holland, who got him out of there in round 3. And a very good fight these two guys had on the regional scene. So yeah, it's happened before. He's been put away, but I don't think Rafael Dos Anjos should be getting that knockout over him. And even though he's been submitted twice, I don't think Rafael Dos Anjos has the physicality of a Shavkat Rakhmonov, and I don't think he's going to go through Jeff Neal on the ground. He might get him there, but I don't think it's enough for him to win the fight. I think Jeff Neal is able to keep this one standing, and at the very least, batter Dos Anjos to a decision, and of course, at the very most, produce a round 3 finish where maybe I'll hit a fucking prop. I have already bet on him at minus 180, and I'll wait to see what else jumps out at me. But I'm content having bet on his money line here for sure. Next up, we have Magomed Ankalaev taking on Alexander Rakic. My prediction for this fight is Ankalaev wins by decision, and that probably won't be my bet even when the props drop. I think the only things I'll be looking to bet on will be Rakic winning by decision and maybe Rakic plus 3.5 points, meaning he at least wins a round. My point is, I do think this will be a close fight, a lot closer than the odds have it. I have to say, I do think Ankalaev would get the first knockout between the two, and if that happens, obviously it's not such a close fight. But Rakic, despite the loss coming in his last fight, he's only legitimately been knocked out once, and it was to Yuri Prohashka, who is one of the most dangerous men on the planet. So there's a little forgiveness there, but still, I think even with the recent knockout loss, Ankalaev would much more likely win a decision here, and that's not something that's going to be so easy. Alexander Rakic is a difficult guy to bully and take down, and on the feet, he can give anybody problems as well. He's not likely to win by triangle choke in round 3, the one way Ankalaev has lost, but I still think he can duplicate the success of some of the guys who have won rounds over Ankalaev, like Nikita Krylov and Jan Blachowicz. And I think Alexander Rakic has really good leg kicks. And if he can chop those legs and keep this fight standing, it's an interesting fight. I'd still favor Ankalaev to out hustle him and get the decision. We've seen him scratch and claw, especially in that Jan Blachowicz fight, where his legs were compromised, but he ended up being the last man standing in a 5-round fight and coming away with the victory. So yeah, the guy is a bona fide winner, but here it's no 5-round fight; it's only a 3-round fight. And Alexander Rakic, he's got to win 2 rounds, and if he is able to keep this fight standing, that's a big plus for him. And I think he's very much in the realm of winning this decision. So it's tempting to bet on his money line right now. He's sitting at 3-1 odds. I haven't done that, but I can tell you I will be looking to sprinkle money on him. I do think a decision is far and away his best path to victory. And I think, even though, again, I've only seen Ankalaev lose once, and it was by triangle choke. So knowing that's not on the table, it's not like I can really say how it'll look when Ankalaev loses. But yeah, I think Rakic is very much in this matchup, and I could envision a tooth and nail decision. So I'm going with Ankalaev. I've got him winning by decision, but I will be looking to put some money on the other side of this matchup here. And again, maybe I would trust plus 3.5 points a little more because that would mean Rakic takes a round or whatever. But that's not going to be such a juicy line like Alexander Rakic by decision. So it'll be safer, but less reward for less risk. Next up, we have Lerone Murphy versus Dan Ige. My prediction for the fight is Lerone Murphy wins by decision. I don't think anybody's going to finish Dan Ige, and I don't think it's any different with Lerone Murphy. Anytime I look at a card, a fight card, and here there are 28 fighters on this fight card, I always look and see whose traits jump out at me for potential bets. And the trait I trust the most here, even though it may not lead to the most bets, but the trait I trust the most is Dan Ige's durability. So I think his opponent, which here is Lerone Murphy, if he is to win, it's got to be by decision. Ige, the closest he's come to being finished, was getting mauled by Movsar Evloev, which I don't think is a path to victory for Lerone Murphy. Ige's also been dropped a few times by Josh Emmett and Edson Barbosa, who really cracked him. But he was able to survive there. And I just think with his heart and his chin, he's going to be a really tough guy to get out of there. Also, his submission skills as well. Speaking of which, that's one of the few technical advantages I'd give to Ige in this fight, his submission skills. I think he's better on the ground than Lerone Murphy in a grappling sense. But I don't think he's got the wrestling and the physicality and athleticism to get this fight down against Lerone Murphy. Maybe here or there, but nothing on the regular. I think Lerone is able to keep this fight standing. And even though Dan Ige is very dangerous on the feet as well, he's got knockout power and he's a really good striker. I still think Lerone Murphy is a better striker, and I still think he hits harder in general as well. So I've got Lerone Murphy winning that type of fight, keeping it standing and getting the better of Dan Ige over the course of 15 minutes. Although, as he showed in his last fight, especially taking the fight on a few hours' notice against Diego Lopez, one of the most dangerous and the very best fighters in the world. And Ige showed that not only could he take his danger, but even on 2 hours' notice or whatever, he can be the last man standing and taking the fight to Lopez in round 3, which was just an awesome fucking sight. So yeah, Dan Ige is going to be really tough to overcome, and he's never going to make it easy on you. Lerone Murphy, he's got a perfect record of 14-0. The closest anybody's come to beating him was Zubaira Tukhugov. That was in his UFC debut, though, Tukhugov. And since then, I got to say it was Gabriel Santos, whom he beat by split decision, but really could have gone either way that fight. It was really close. But still, Lerone Murphy's handled adversity well, and he's never looked better than he did in his last fight against Edson Barbosa, firing on all cylinders for 25 minutes. I should mention Ige beat Barbosa as well, but it was a split decision and a much tighter fight. There was nothing tight at all about the Lerone Murphy fight. He beat up Edson Barbosa, and I think he's leveled up here. He's been looking great, and I'm picking him to beat Dan Ige. I don't think he'll get him out of there with any of his danger. This isn't Ricardo Ramos or Makwan Amirkhani here, but I still think the power of Lerone Murphy will be visible, and it'll help score some points. So, yeah, I'm going with Lerone Murphy winning by decision. I think he takes away the jiu-jitsu advantage of Dan Ige. I think he's able to keep the fight standing in general. And even though Ige is still a problem for Lerone, and Lerone's been cracked as well, I still think he keeps himself safe and lands the better strikes on Dan Ige. Lerone Murphy by decision is the pick, and I have not bet on him, not yet. I got to wait for the props. And in the co-main event of the evening, we have Khamzat Chimaev versus Robert Whittaker in an amazing fucking fight that is booked for 5 rounds. My prediction for this fight, and I say this with not a lot of confidence, is Robert Whittaker wins by decision. The basis for the prediction, as you might imagine, is Robert Whittaker has really good cardio. He's been 5 rounds plenty of times, and I think he can outlast Khamzat Chimaev and keep the fight standing and out hustle him for a decision victory. Of course, Khamzat Chimaev hasn't given me any reason to really doubt him. My prediction here with Robert Whittaker is based on some speculation, but the reality is Khamzat Chimaev's only been in 2 competitive fights in his whole career, against Gilbert Burns and Kamaru Usman, and he dug deep in both of them. He had an answer in round 3. And I know he looked like he was just holding on to Kamaru Usman in round 3. Who can take down Kamaru Usman? That's not an option that's available to a lot of fighters. And Khamzat Chimaev, after taking him down and dominating him early, he was able to secure a second takedown on exhaustion. Or, he was very tired anyway. But the point is, look, he's been tired. He's been discouraged. And it looked like at some points he was being outpointed. And he's fought through all of that. And in the end, I think both of those fights were decisive victories for Khamzat Chimaev. And I have to attribute both wins to his round 3 effort. So even though I'm picking him to slow down like he did against Kamaru Usman and for Robert Whittaker to keep the fight standing and get the better of him, I still don't have anything to look to that gives me a lot of confidence in that. It's all just speculation. And I think Robert Whittaker, being a wrestler first and foremost, a lot of people don't know that. I think he's a difficult guy to out wrestle as well. Very difficult. But I don't think he's as difficult as Kamaru Usman is. Of course, Kamaru did take that fight on a few days' notice and whatever the rest of it. So who really knows? But I'm still picking Whittaker here. I think he's got to survive round 1. And even though Whittaker's never been submitted, that does entail not getting submitted. Because Khamzat Chimaev's a submission threat for anybody, especially when you're in an awful position. And he's perhaps more likely in danger of getting knocked out, Whittaker. He's a guy who's been knocked out a few times throughout the years. And, of course, Khamzat Chimaev, while he's a much better grappler, we've seen he's got some power, and he could put away Gerald Mearshart in 17 seconds. So Whittaker's definitely got to watch out for everything early on. But I do think that knockout and even the submission, I think all the finish threats go away in round 1. It's not a lock. I know Khamzat Chimaev is aware that he's going to have to fight 5 rounds. He's been aware of that for a while, and I'm sure he knows how he felt in these competitive fights with Burns and Usman. So I'm sure he's tried to patch up his cardio, if there is even anything to patch up. What the fuck do I know? But I still think Robert Whittaker, tried and tested, championship level fighter, championship rounds. The guy's been there, done that, and he'd be the guy that I'd expect to come alive here down the stretch. So I'm thinking Whittaker outlasts Chimaev and is able to outpoint him, putting those hands on him down the stretch. And because I've never seen Khamzat Chimaev get finished, of course, I've never seen him lose. But because I've never seen him get finished, I'll go with Whittaker winning by decision. And Whittaker, I've bet on him. Nothing crazy, because again, even though he's a nice, juicy underdog, I don't have too much confidence in the pick. I mean, Khamzat Chimaev is a scary person to bet against. Even picking against him, I feel like he's going to show up and beat the shit out of me. But I do think Robert Whittaker can put hands on him, even in a way that Kamaru Usman wasn't able to. When Kamaru was coming alive and it looked like he was taking over the fight, I think Robert Whittaker can really take over the fight, especially if they go even deeper than that. And Whittaker's hands will come alive, and I've got him outpointing Chimaev. But yeah, I'll look for Robert Whittaker winning by finish down the stretch, of course. Those are also bets against the cardio of Khamzat Chimaev, which, again, even though I can't prove is a thing, I'm picking against it and I will bet against it. But yeah, really, just this one is a reach. I wouldn't be surprised at all to see Khamzat Chimaev win. And I would be very impressed, to be honest, if Khamzat Chimaev won this fight down the stretch by either finish anytime after round one, especially after round two. That would be really impressive. Or even a decision. I think it would impress the hell out of me. I want to see what he looks like in a competitive fight in those championship rounds. But yeah, I've done a lot of rambling here. I'm going with Robert Whittaker. And in the main event of the evening, we have Ilia Topuria defending his featherweight title against Max Holloway. My prediction for this fight is Max Holloway wins by decision. I think he's going to have to go to war to win this fight. But I think he will go to war because he is a warrior. And I also think his chin is a big part of what keeps him safe here. Ilia Topuria's got killer knockout power. And even though he's my top pick to knock out Max Holloway of all the candidates, I still don't think he's going to knock out Max Holloway. I think Max's chin is that solid. So assuming he can take away that kill shot from Topuria, I think this is a close fight between two excellent boxers. And I'm going with Max because I've seen him in these 5-round competitive fights, which is what I'd expect this one to be. And that's a fight that Max rarely loses. He's been in there so many times, going back years and years, and he's been a reliable 5-round fighter. Ilia Topuria has been 5 rounds, but it was against Josh Emmett. And even though Josh Emmett is one of the best fighters in the world, he wasn't in Ilia's class there. Ilia outclassed him, and Josh came alive here and there, but it wasn't the most taxing, exerting fight for Ilia Topuria, and I don't think it really tested his cardio in a way like Max Holloway will if these guys find themselves deep into the fight, which I think they will. Of course, I could be wrong about all that. I mean, just like I said with Khamzat Chimaev and every other undefeated fighter, you don't know what their weaknesses are. I've seen Ilia Topuria dropped with a head kick from Jai Herbert. I've seen Yusuf Zalal outwork him down the stretch. Looked like he was in better shape in round 3. I've seen him get punched in the face a few times in the rest of it. But he's undefeated, and he's got 13 finishes in his 15 wins. So he's a killer. Uh, Yusuf Zalal and Josh Emmett are the only two guys to survive with him. Everyone else he's put away. That includes submitting Bryce Mitchell and, of course, knocking out Alexander Volkanovski. That Volkanovski fight, Volkanovski, I thought, took round 1 from him, speaking of adversity that he's faced. But Topuria ended up going through him, corralling him, cornering him, and knocking him out. And here, like I said, he's my top candidate to knock out Max Holloway, and I don't think Max would be wise to point to the mat and start exchanging hooks. And if Topuria challenges Max to that right away, like he said he's gonna, Max should sit that one out. Because Max is the sharper guy compared to Justin Gaethje, but in tight, he's not as sharp as Ilia Topuria. This guy's hands are phenomenal, and he's got bona fide power already. Again, I don't think he can knock out Max Holloway, but he's definitely the more dangerous guy. Although if you ask Justin Gaethje about that, he might disagree. But yeah, I'm going with Max. I trust his durability to be there. Although the one time he's lost, been finished, was by Dustin Poirier's armbar, triangle armbar, over a decade ago. And I'll say this, I think Ilia Topuria gets the first submission in this matchup. I think he's the much more dangerous and skilled submission artist. A lot of his early wins are submissions, and as of late, it's really only been the Bryce Mitchell win. But that ain't a bad guy to submit at all. So he's definitely the more dangerous guy there, but I don't think he's going to be dominating Max on the ground, let alone finishing him. And on the feet, while I think both guys are very much in the fight, it's a very close matchup. I'll give the edge certainly to Max Holloway. Max Holloway's already got my bet because he's over 2-1. But I can tell you the one bet that I'll be looking to play heavily for Max Holloway will be his plus 5.5 points, which means Max can't get finished and he has to win a round. I'm very sure he doesn't get finished, and I'm very sure he wins a round as well. But that line might not be so juicy because these aren't exactly unknown traits with Max Holloway. But yeah, I'm going with Max. He's a guy that's got a lot of momentum, even though he doesn't have nearly the winning streak of Ilia Topuria. But he's still in his prime at 32 years old. No shakiness in Max whatsoever. That knockdown against Gaethje, I don't think that doesn't register with me. I still think he faced much more danger in the Poirier rematch, and he still stood up to all of that. So I'm taking him to stand up to Topuria, to go through the fire, and to turn this into a competitive dogfight where Max Holloway has been there before and Topuria hasn't. Max by tight decision is the pick. And again, the bet, I'll be looking for plus 5.5 points for my heaviest bet on this fight, but I have to see what that even looks like. Like, share, subscribe, all that horse shit, and check out my other videos.